Hi everybody, I hope that you're all doing really well. So I have popped back from my self-imposed YouTube hiatus to talk about Jane Austen, doing my promised video to run down the 6 major novels of Jane Austen and rank them in terms of my personal preferences. I know so many of us on BookTube are massive fans of Jane Austen. It's why Jane Austen July continues to be so popular, and I know that everybody has their own thoughts and opinions on each of the major novels of Jane Austen and where they personally fit into their rankings. I know there have been a few people who've been excited to hear my thoughts on this, so let's just get on into it. I want to put the disclaimer out right now just to say that of course this is my personal preference. You may not agree with everything that I say, and in fact I'm expecting some people to not agree with my ranking. And also to say that even though I may have ranked one of these novels lower down, that isn't to say that I don't like it because it's my least favourite. I love Jane Austen, she is one of my favourite authors. Pretty much everything that I've ever read by Jane Austen has been like a strong 3-star at the very least if you go by star ranking. There's always something in a Jane Austen novel that I just love. There's always a characteristic wit to Jane Austen's writing, but it might be that I'm just not a massive fan of the characters or the particular plot of this book. It's probably just that in comparison to the other books that I rank higher, this one just doesn't quite live up to my expectation. But that isn't to say that I think that any of these books are bad because I rate them lower. So starting off at number 6, like I say, this is going to be my least favourite Jane Austen, but that isn't to say that I don't like it. And I feel like I have to say that straight away because my 6th place is going to be perhaps a bit controversial. I know that this is a bit of a favourite for quite a lot of Jane Austen fans. And yeah, the book that I would say is my least favourite Jane Austen book is Persuasion. Do not come for me. So in Persuasion, we are following Anne Elliot, who is Jane Austen's oldest heroine at the ripe old age of 27 years old. Practically a spinster. We meet her at a time when her family are not in the best circumstances. They have spent a lot of their money and are not economically doing very well. They are trying to work out how best to save money. She ends up spending her time with her extended family whilst her immediate family get a little house in Bath. Through the course of the book, she ends up reuniting with an old flame of hers, Captain Wentworth, who she'd been engaged to many years before, but her family had persuaded her to not go ahead with the wedding, thinking that he was too poor and too low down socially to match with her. However, 8 years have now passed, the Napoleonic Wars have been fought, and Captain Wentworth has made quite a name for himself and quite a lot of wealth and riches. And Anne is still very much in love with him, but it appears like Captain Wentworth is feeling a little bit bitter for the rejection that he suffered 8 years ago. So this is Jane Austen's story of, can these two ex-lovers find their way back to each other? Can he ever forgive her for being persuaded by her family to put him aside 8 years ago? Yeah, I know that so many people absolutely love Persuasion. They say it's the best Jane Austen, it's the most mature Jane Austen, it's her most accomplished book. And I don't know, I just don't agree. If I'm being really brutally honest, like whenever I hear people say it's her most mature work, there is a part of me that thinks, by most mature, is that just a euphemism for most boring? Because I feel like not much happens in this book. And I've always been a very big advocate with Jane Austen. Whenever people say that they find her work to be boring, that there's not much going on in the plot, I know that people who like a fast-paced, like adventure kind of book, that Jane Austen is not going to provide that. And I often hear people saying, oh, people are just sat around in rooms having conversations, like nothing happens. And I'm like, no, don't you see? It feels like not much has happened, but actually everything has happened in this scene. In this one conversation, there's been so much commentary, so much social commentary on manners and societal norms and expectations. Just because in terms of action it doesn't feel like much has happened, that doesn't mean that nothing has happened. But I don't know, with Persuasion, it is one of the Jane Austens where I do genuinely feel like nothing happens and then everything kind of happens towards the end. Everything kind of wraps up towards the end. And I know that there are other things going on in the story of Persuasion aside from the main love story between Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, but honestly, like I've read this book twice and I could not tell you what else happens aside from that story. I don't find the characters to be as distinct and full of personality as her others. Like I say, aside from Anne Elliot and Captain Wentworth, I genuinely could not tell any of these characters apart. And once again, if I'm gonna be really brutally honest, I do not find Captain Wentworth that appealing as a Jane Austen love interest. I just don't see it. I know so many people absolutely love Captain Wentworth and they swoon over the letter scene, the infamous letter scene, which is always pegged as like the most romantic letter in literature. And once again, one of my controversial opinions, that did not live up to the hype for me. And I think it didn't live up to the hype because I don't find him a compelling love interest. He spends so much of the time just kind of bitter and mopey. And from what we see in the actual story of Persuasion, I don't buy that there is this like massive romantic sexual tension between Anne and Wentworth. I feel like it's all derived arrived, it's all focused on the fact that, you know, 8 years ago they had so much chemistry, but I don't feel like we see any of that in the actual book. Jane Austen is like, don't worry guys, like, believe me, if we were to flash back to 8 years ago, you would see how well suited they are to each other. But in the bit that we're reading, which is 8 years from then, we don't see them interacting that much. Whenever he does kind of interact with her, it's in this kind of like aloof, I'm still really bitter with you for turning me down. And I'm just like, I get it, but also get over yourself. And because of that, I just don't find him compelling. And then suddenly he sends this letter and it's like, oh my God, he loved her the whole time. And I don't buy it. I don't find Anne particularly dynamic either. I feel like she's defined much more by what she's not than what she actually is. She's defined by being more of an Eleanor in a sea of Mariannes than she is for having her own unique personality. Aside from that, her personality is helpful, good in a crisis, and that is pretty much it. There is so much about Jane Austen's writing in this that is so sparkly and lovely, and you know, it's a Jane Austen book and I will always be somewhat engaged in it, but in terms of these characters and this plot, yeah, this is why it's rated lower down for me. There is a lot to commend in it. I don't hate it by any means, but it's not, it just doesn't, it never leaves an impact on me. I've read it twice now, and the first time that I read it, I was like, yes, this is good, but aside from that, it left no impression. And then the sixth time, I've realised that even though some of the books in here that are ranked higher than this, I may have like some more negative opinions about, but they at least left some sort of impact on me, and Persuasion never has. And I feel like on some level there's going to be somebody who's like, well, maybe it's because you're not mature enough to appreciate Persuasion, and I'm like, I don't know, I don't think that that's the reason. I just don't think this is the Jane Austen for me. Next up, number 5 on my list, once again, might be a controversial one, it is Sense and Sensibility. In Sense and Sensibility, we meet the Dashwood family, particularly the 2 eldest daughters, Eleanor and Marianne. The title Sense and Sensibility comes from the 2 opposing personalities of the 2 sisters. Eleanor, who is the sense of the title, who is very practical, pragmatic, she is very controlled and reserved in her feelings, whereas Marianne is completely the opposite. She is very much somebody who wears her heart on her sleeve. She is very romantic, she is very melodramatic. She lets people know at all times what she is feeling, exactly the moment when she is feeling it. And we see how these conflicting personalities can really do a disservice to both sisters. We're meeting the Dashwoods at quite a contentious point in their life where their father has recently died, and because of male primogeniture and the fact that Mr. Dashwood had been married previously and had a son with his first wife, all of the wealth of the Dashwoods and the family home goes to that son, leaving the Dashwood sisters with very, very little to live on. They're dealing with grief and having to move out of their family home, living on much less than they had previously. And so through this story, we are seeing them settling into a new home and also finding some romance. That is a very simplified version of what happens in Sense and Sensibility, but there it is. It is my little taster for you. This is the book that prior to this reread that I did of all of the major novels of Jane Austen, I actually said was my least favourite. It's another one where I just do not understand the hype. I especially do not understand how some people say that this is better than another book that is on this list. I feel like this is the book that often people cite as the first Jane Austen that you should read, and I disagree. I feel like this could put people off Jane Austen. Once again, not because it's bad. I think there is so much good in this book, but I think once again it is another like slower paced Jane Austen novel where not much happens. And I think a slightly less plotty Jane Austen has the potential to lose people, and so they don't really get to appreciate the social commentary, they don't get to appreciate her wit as much because they're kind of sat reading it and thinking, why is nothing happening? Another reason that I do rank this slightly lower down is that I find most of the characters, bar Eleanor and Colonel Brandon, to be really deeply annoying. And that's not to say that there aren't other annoying characters in Jane Austen. There definitely are, but I usually find something redeeming or at least enjoyable in the annoying characters. But in Sense and Sensibility, I'm reading it and thinking, why are you this way? Do you have to be like this? And it kind of has the opposite problem to Persuasion, where Persuasion is really, really short and nothing happens, and it kind of feels like you've barely begun the book and yet you're halfway through. With Sense and Sensibility, it's got the opposite problem where not a lot happens and it's a longer Jane Austen. And you're kind of sat there thinking, I feel like some of this could have been cut. Like I say, I really do love Eleanor Dashwood as a character. I feel like she's one of the characters of Jane Austen that I see a lot of myself in, which seems like a kind of narcissistic reason to say that you like somebody, but you know, meh. I just love seeing the journey that she goes on. I really appreciate seeing like her internal struggle with her feelings about Edward Ferrars and how she is a character who holds so much of her beliefs and opinions in, whereas her sister Marianne is the sensibility of the Sense and Sensibility, and she will blurt out any opinion she has at any time. Any feelings she has, she will let everybody know, which is quite funny because I feel like that's a dynamic I can definitely see it play in my family. In terms of how different people in my family operate, we are definitely a sense and sensibility family, where me and my dad can be quite reserved and we don't always let our feelings out all of the time, whereas my sister and my mum are very, very open and they do tell people about their emotions when they're feeling them. And both sides can have its perks and pitfalls. And I really do love seeing the family dynamic of the Dashwoods. And I really, really love seeing Colonel Brandon and Eleanor's friendship. I really like how they both seem to get each other, and I think that's why they are my two favourite characters in this book. But once again, you know, the main driving point of Jane Austen is usually the romantic interests, and I don't find either pairing to be that interesting. I would say, if anything, Marianne and Colonel Brandon are maybe my favourite pairing of the two that we see, but that's more because I like Colonel Brandon as a character rather than I think that he really suits Marianne. I feel like a big criticism of Sense and Sensibility I often see is that Marianne is kind of thrown to Colonel Brandon. It's kind of like, you couldn't have Willoughby, so here you go. Good job on Colonel Brandon for being a nice guy throughout the book and deserving Marianne. And yeah, I definitely see that, and I think that their relationship at the end is kind of rushed. Not for Colonel Brandon, like he has very much loved Marianne throughout the entire book, but Marianne's eventual attraction to him I think is a bit rushed. But here again we have one of my controversial opinions, which is that I do not think that Edward Ferrars is that interesting a character. I think he's a bit of a wet blanket, and I feel like adaptation has more to do with people liking him as a character than what is presented to us in the book, because I feel like in the 1995 movie where it's Hugh Grant playing Edward Ferrars, you know, he makes him like the traditional Hugh Grant character. He's kind of bumbling and awkward, and we see him having real chemistry with Emma Thompson. But at the beginning of the book we never see them actually having that chemistry. We never see the scenes where they meet and they get to know each other. We just are kind of told that that's what happens. We're kind of told that Eleanor is in love with him, but we don't see why. So she spends most of the book pining for him, and I'm like, why am I meant to care about this guy that you like when the book has never really shown us why we should care? I care about you as a pairing purely because I like Eleanor and I want Eleanor to be happy. But quite frankly, I feel like Colonel Brandon and Eleanor could have gotten together and I would have been much more happy with that, because at least I've actually seen them talk to each other. I'm just somebody who is very much into my characters and their relationships to each other and them having scenes together and having like that witty repartee, and I just don't get that from Eleanor and Edward Ferrars. And like I say, I just think he's a bit of a wet blanket and he doesn't have a real distinct personality, and that's what I need from my Austen romantic leads. Next up, number 4 on my ranking is Mansfield Park. So in the story of Mansfield Park, there are 3 sisters who all marry differently. We have the sister who will come to be Mrs. Bertram, who marries for wealth, the other sister, Mrs. Norris, who marries okay, not amazingly, but you know, respectably. And then we have Mrs. Price, who marries very low beneath her, who marries for love, but not with a consideration of the financial situation. The other 2 sisters kind of cut her out of their life, as Mrs. Price ends up having a lot more children than she can afford. She cannot afford to keep all of them, and so Mrs. Bertram and Mrs. Norris come up with a plan to look after the eldest daughter. So Fanny Price, around the age of 10 years old, is brought to Mansfield Park to be brought up along with the Bertram children. However, we see very quickly that Fanny Price is not treated quite the same as the other children. There is not as much love and admiration shown to her. She's very much thought of as just being the companion to Mrs. Bertram, but definitely not an equal within the family. That is from everybody aside from her cousin, Edmund, whom Fanny quickly latches onto and starts to form a bit of an attachment to him. We see as Fanny Price and her cousins grow up, and how as prospects of matrimony start to play a part, how her cousins can be quite easily susceptible to charming, witty strangers that they come to meet. There was part of me that wanted to rank this at 3rd place because I'm such a staunch defender of Mansfield Park, and I know so many people don't like it, and I'm just like, why? It's so good! But I haven't, because I do think there are stronger Austens and Austens that are more my favourite. And the thing that I am most offensive about with Mansfield Park is its heroine, Fanny Price. I am very much on the train of justice for Fanny Price, because I know so many people peg Mansfield Park as their least favourite because they don't like Fanny Price, and I do not get it. And I think part of the reason I feel so defensive about this is because I can so see, especially my teenage self, in Fanny Price. She is a character who is very quiet, she's very meek and mild-mannered. She's a character who throughout a lot of the book is kind of bullied by her relatives. She's often very put upon, her feelings are not considered, and I feel like people are so used to characters like Elizabeth Bennet, who is so fiery and witty, and they want to see Fanny Price have that same kind of fire and to stand up for herself. And because she never talks back to, for example, Aunt Norris, who is horrible, one of the most detestable characters that Jane Austen ever wrote, they kind of peg her as being weak-willed, as being a weak heroine, not a strong character. And I really disagree. I know that Olive over at Book Olive did a fantastic defense of Fanny Price as a character, and I'm definitely going to leave it down below because she will say it so much more eloquently than I ever could. But I feel like through the course of Mansfield Park, It's Jane Austen showing us how strong female characters do not have to be these sharp-tongued, fiery characters. Like Elizabeth Bennet, you can also be a quiet person and be strong too. You can be quiet and soft-spoken and still be a strong character. Because Fanny Price is not weak-willed at all. She is somebody who is very strong in her moral convictions. She is incredibly, incredibly resilient, especially after years of abuse from her relatives. After years and years of being told by her relatives that she's not good enough. Like, she doesn't care. She gets to a point where that doesn't affect her anymore. And that's why she doesn't respond, because she knows the situation that she is in. After years of having this from her relatives, she knows that there is no good that can come from talking back, that would only make the situation worse. And so whenever she gets a mean comment from one of her relatives, it just doesn't faze her. And you see how the people around her underestimate her and then are really surprised when she shows that she actually does have a lot of very strong convictions. And when it comes to something that she really truly doesn't want to do, unlike her other cousins, she isn't so easily swayed. Rather than being a very, very plotty book, Mansfield Park is much more of a character study, and it's this intense character study on Fanny Price and how people often underestimate her, of how people devalue her, and yet she still keeps her head held high. She keeps her basic niceness intact. She keeps her moral convictions intact, despite so many people telling her that she must change how she is. I think she's an incredibly strong character, and I really love her. I think she's great. I think I ended up rating this lower the last time that I read Jane Austen because I wasn't that much of a fan of Edmund Bertram, who is Fanny Price's cousin and who is later her love interest, though Fanny has loved him since she was a child. And I think part of the reason is that, yes, it is kind of weird and a bit creepy that her love interest is her first cousin. Different times, but also because, once again, like with Edward Ferrars, I kind of thought he was a bit of a wet blanket, and the fact that he spends so much of his time in love with another woman and completely ignoring Fanny, and then it felt like suddenly very rushed for him to fall in love with Fanny. But actually, on this reread, I don't think that is the case. I still don't love Edmund as a character, and I feel like Fanny could have done so much better than him, but I do recognise that even when his attentions were elsewhere, he was still very considerate and caring of Fanny's feelings and trying as much as he can to make sure that he is paying the attentions to her. And he's really the only member of the family who ever thinks to do such a thing. So whilst he isn't one of my favourite Jane Austen men, you know, I think he has some merit. I think the supporting characters in Mansfield Park, whilst not my favourite, are still really interesting. I absolutely despise Aunt Norris with every fibre of my being. I think I'm very personally affronted by her because she is an aunt and I am also an aunt, and if anybody spoke to my niece the way that she speaks to Fanny, I'm not a violent person, so I probably wouldn't smack her, but I'd be thinking it. I would give her a hard stare like Paddington. The next Jane Austen book, ranked number 3, is Northanger Abbey. In Northanger Abbey, we're following the main character of Catherine Morland. She's described as being not your traditional heroine. She's not particularly pretty or bright or witty, but she has an insatiable love of Gothic novels. And so we see what happens to her when she is taken by a family friend over to Bath to finally have some society, and the different characters that she meets along the way. I love this book, and I specifically love Henry Tilney. He is one of my favourite Jane Austen men. I just find him delightful. I feel like lots of people tend to rate Northanger Abbey a bit lower because it's one of Jane Austen's shorter works, it's one of her earlier ones, so they don't see it as having as much skill as her later books. But I don't know, I just get a lot of enjoyment from it. I love how witty and satirical she is in this book. As a lot of people tend to point out, she's really satirising the Gothic novel conventions, the melodrama of the dramatic novel, and I just find it really funny. I love how meta she kind of is in her construction of the book. She'll often talk about how Catherine Morland is behaving as a heroine and talking about how usually in a novel this plot point would happen, and then she'll kind of subvert it, and I love that. I love that as a theme. I think for such a short book, like, a lot happens. I think it's a really, really sweet coming of age book from Jane Austen, and even though it doesn't quite hit the heights of the last 2 books that I'm going to talk about, I still have such a soft spot for it. What I will say is that I feel like Northanger Abbey is often pegged as a book in which the main character is kind of naive and very gullible, and she doesn't recognise other people lying to her and how she can't really read people. Whereas when I was rereading it, I was thinking, like, I feel like Catherine has every right to not understand what people are getting at when they're talking to her, because this is really a book about lack of communication and about how people blatantly lie, especially the character of Isabella. Like, she will say one thing and she means completely the other. And there are times when I'm reading what Isabella is saying and I'm like, how is Catherine meant to decode this? Maybe this just speaks for me as being a very gullible person who will believe what people tell me, but like, I felt a lot of sympathy for Catherine, and I kind of feel like Catherine, like, I wish people would just say what they mean, rather than what the characters do in this book, which is so much doublespeak. There are a lot of characters in Northanger Abbey who either completely lack any sense of self-awareness, or they are blatantly lying, in which case it is not Catherine's fault for not being able to understand them. I don't know, that's just me. But I feel like people often paint Catherine as being like really silly, and I don't think that's the case. I don't think that's really a fair assessment of her. Then the penultimate book that I'm going to talk about, book number 2, my second favourite Jane Austen, that book is Emma. In Emma, we meet the main character, Emma Woodhouse, who is handsome, clever and rich, who has long since decided that she is not going to marry, but she is quite happy to pair off everybody around her. She is definitely a character who likes to meddle in the affairs of others, particularly a new friend, Harriet Smith, who catches her interest, who she tries to pair up with the local vicar. However, she comes to realise that her meddling is doing more harm than good, and how maybe she's not reading people quite as skillfully as she thinks. I love Emma so much, and really there isn't much in it between this book and the one that is above it. I don't know why I'm being coy about it when you can quite clearly tell which is my favourite Jane Austen, but I just think Emma is delightful. I feel like Emma Woodhouse is definitely my favourite Jane Austen heroine, and Mr. Knightley, as I've said many times before, is definitely my favourite Jane Austen man. I love their relationship to each other. I love how they really push each other to do better. I love that they are friends who are very comfortable with each other, and that is the reason that they are able to push each other's buttons so much, is because they know each other so well, and that friendship eventually blossoms into love. I know that there are some critics of Emma who say, isn't it a bit weird that Mr. Knightley is like 16 years older than her? And I feel like one of the things that is often cited as a bit weird is that when he tells her that he loves her, he says something that kind of sounds like he's saying, I've loved you since you were 13, you know, and he was 29, which is a bit weird. But when I went back to reread this, I don't think that that's what he's saying. I could be completely wrong, but this is how I took it. When he's talking about how he has shown love to her, he talks about how he's been kind of an indifferent lover, and how it seems like most of his love for Emma has come out in him criticising her, in him telling her off, in telling her when she's done wrong, because he is the only person who will ever do that. Everybody else kind of fawns over Emma, and he's the only person who will not do that. And he says something to the effect of, if this is the way that I've been showing you love, then I must have loved you since you were 13 years old. That is definitely paraphrasing, I don't think that's the exact wording. But for me, rather than taking that as, I've loved you since you were 13 years old, i.e. a bit creepy, he's joking about the fact that he has basically been criticising her for her behaviour since she was 13 years old. I don't know, tell me if you think I'm wrong. I probably am, but that is how I'm justifying it in my head so it feels less creepy. And aside from that, I just enjoy them too much as a pair to really be bothered by. Once again, different times. And aside from that, I also just love the other plots that are going on in Emma. I really enjoy finding out more about Frank Churchill and Jane Fairfax, and I think especially the 2009 or 2008 BBC miniseries really draws out how similar these three characters are of Emma, Jane and Frank, and yet how their lives took different paths. And I think that's definitely an interesting reading that you can take to the book. I find the characters just so funny, especially Mrs. Bates, especially Mrs. Elton. They are so ridiculous, but it's so enjoyable. And I think so many people don't like Emma because she is like this very meddling, not very nice character for a lot of the book. But this book is really about her journey to become a better person and less judgmental. I like that we have a Jane Austen heroine who isn't perfect, who can be kind of mean sometimes, but she really does grow up and becomes a better person. And you know, also Emma inspired Clueless, and I love Clueless, so. Which then leaves my number 1 spot, my favourite Jane Austen book. Kind of predictable, but it is Pride and Prejudice. In Pride and Prejudice, we have the classic story of the 5 Bennet sisters and how their life is completely upturned by the arrival of 2 very handsome, very wealthy gentlemen to their local area. There is not a single thing that I dislike about this book. I think this is just perfection in a Jane Austen novel. I love every single character in this book, like even the most detestable characters like Caroline Bingley or Mr. Wickham. I enjoy hating them. I love to hate these characters. They are so delicious in their evilness. I think there are some fantastic like unsung heroes in Pride and Prejudice, like the gardeners, who they are the MVPs of this entire book, and this is why I love the other Bennet sisters so much, because they really bring the gardeners to the forefront. I love how distinct the personalities are of each of the 5 Bennet sisters. I love how flighty and silly Mrs. Bennet is, of how reserved and kind of bitter and sarcastic Mr. Bennet is. I love how jolly but also kind of gullible Mr. Bingley is, and of course Elizabeth and Mr. Darcy. And I feel like rereading it has really given me a much greater appreciation for their relationship and their dynamic, which I honestly... Okay, right, so... Here is my slightly controversial opinion about Jane Austen adaptations. Even though I absolutely adore both the 1995 and 2005 adaptations of Pride and Prejudice, I do not yet think that anybody has quite captured the personality of Lizzie Bennet, and particularly quite how silly she can be. I feel like the main defining feature that Jane Austen gives us of Lizzie is that, yes, she is witty, but she is somebody who delights in silliness. She delights in the ridiculous. I don't think that anybody has really captured that properly yet. And I feel like both Jennifer Ehle and Keira Knightley kind of portray her as much more reserved than she actually is in the books. I think nobody has yet captured this playfulness of Elizabeth Bennet, which I think is so essential to her character, and I think really essential to her relationship with Mr. Darcy, because I think her playfulness and her delighting in the ridiculous drives so much of their interactions, particularly before he ends up proposing to her the first time. There are times in the book where she's kind of looking at Mr. Darcy across a crowded room and she's thinking to herself, Mr. Darcy looks really annoyed right now. It would be a shame if somebody were to interrupt his thoughts. It would be a shame if someone were to annoy him. And she goes over and she kind of pokes the bear. She can't help herself. And Mr. Darcy is having to interact with Elizabeth, and you can kind of see why it is that he would think that she likes him. Because unlike in the adaptations where she can come across quite rude to him, quite cold to him, understandably, but in the book, I feel like she is a lot more polite than she is letting on. We know that she's annoyed with Mr. Darcy, but her actual behaviour, because of the polite society of the time, she can't really tell him, she can't communicate to him how annoyed she is by him. So every time she interacts with him, it's with this veneer of politeness. And I can completely see why Mr. Darcy would see her kind of poking fun at him, but thinking that it is well-intentioned. Whereas she's kind of thinking, I'm pointing out his flaws, I'm completely roasting this man. And he's thinking, oh, she's just comfortable with me. She's kind of joking with me. And I can completely get why Mr. Darcy might see that as affection. She is somebody who feels so comfortable with me that she can poke fun at me, which is something that I would only permit by people who I'm really, really close to. So when it comes to that first proposal scene, I can completely understand why Book Darcy would be so shocked by the fact that Elizabeth turns out to not like him, because I feel like every sign to him, at least, has pointed that she does like him, because she's comfortable enough to joke around him and he's comfortable enough to let her joke with him. Whereas in the film, like, I feel like it's very, very clear that Elizabeth doesn't really like him and that she's kind of cold to him, so I don't really get why he is so shocked. I don't know, this really is just me rambling about Jane Austen. I also just think that this is the most well plotted of Jane Austen's books. I feel like it's very dynamic. I feel like a lot of things happen, and I think that's partially because you've got so many characters moving around all over the place in a way that you just don't get with the other books. You have initially Mr. Bingley coming to Netherfield. You have them going to different balls and parties. Jane going to Netherfield, Jane coming back, them having the big party disaster at Netherfield, Mr. Bingley leaving, and then Jane leaving, and then Elizabeth leaving momentarily to go over to the Collinses' house at Rosings. Elizabeth coming back from Rosings. Elizabeth going to Derbyshire with the gardeners, and then coming back. Like, there's a lot of travel that is happening in this book, and I think that's what keeps the plot really upbeat. So yeah, I think the plot is great. I think everything is really nicely paced. I think the characters are absolutely fantastic. I love every single character in this book. I love this love story, but I also love its commentary on family. I love the social commentary that's happening in this book about wealth and class, about politeness and behaviour. Pride and Prejudice is just one of my favourite books of all time. I think it's great, and I feel like if you are looking for the Jane Austen to start your love of Jane Austen, I would always recommend Pride and Prejudice first. I don't get why people leave Pride and Prejudice to the end. I just think it's the best one. Start with the best one. I don't think there is a need to build up to this book. I think you are perfectly fine to start with it. So those are my opinions about Jane Austen. Do let me know if you would disagree with me at all in the comment section. I'm sure people are gonna have opinions. Any thoughts that you have in the comment section below, I would love to hear from you. I hope you're having a fantastic, fantastic day, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Thanks. Bye.